the icon we're going to go to is on my left-hand side under my Launch toolbar, where we'll go ahead and we'll open up my reporting module. And when I do, it brings me in my reporting module where I've got a half a dozen icons in the upper left-hand corner. We're going to bypass the end-of-day process, not part of today's conversation. Where we're going to focus is on these two icons here that say Sales Reports and Other Reports. If you've been on these webinars with me through the course of 2015, one of the things I typically like to do is start out with, well, why does it matter? Meaning, why is this topic relevant and or important? And I would tell you that this is probably the first one I'd come to where I'd say it's really fairly inherently obvious. Now, as we look at sales reports or the reporting functionality in RO Writer, it's really helping us to measure how the shop is performed and or keep track for accounting purposes of all of the different sales transactions. So really, I need to get too deep into exactly what and or why, but I want to look at these two icons here, again, particularly the sales reports icon with a quick look at other reports as we finish up the morning's conversation. If I click on Sales Reports, it brings up my Sales Reports window. In this window, there's about 30 to 35 different reports. One of the things I will tell you, and this is true for any reports in RO Writer, whether it's sales reports, inventory, accounts payable, accounts receivable, anywhere you can find reports in RO Writer. One of the great resources that you have available to you is the Help menu as far as reports are concerned. So before we actually get into the reports themselves, if we go up under Help, and in the Help menu, we've got either Help and or About. In our case, we'll click on Help. It's going to launch the RO Writer Help menu, where we have our integrated manual for RO Writer. Specifically to today's conversation, if you go down to the reporting section, so I clicked on Reporting on the left-hand side, what you'll notice is there's an article on the Summary Report, an article on the Shop Performance Report, one on the RO Sales Ledger. If I was to compare that list to the list that's in my Sales Report window, well, there's the Summary Report, the Shop Performance Report, the RO Sales Ledger. There is literally an article in our Help menu about each report that's in the system. So if you have a question about a report, what, why, and or how, this is a great resource that you can look at to determine exactly why that report exists, what sort of data is there, and how does the data get populated to put it onto that report. So again, before we get too deep into the reports, just a resource that you have at your discretion or at your fingertips to go ahead and figure out exactly what's going on with RO Writer in the reports. In this window here, again, there's about 30 or 35 different reports. My intention this morning is not to go through every one of the reports, look at it, talk about each one of them to a certain degree of detail. I want to talk about the functionality of the window and highlight about a dozen reports or so that are available in this Sales Reports window that I find used more frequently than others. Again, there's purpose to every one of them, and if there's a specific report you'd like to ask a question about, I'd encourage you to do so through the questions pane, but we're going to go through the ones that I want to highlight as we go through this morning's conversation. We're going to start out with the Summary Report. Now, the Summary Report is kind of a 50,000-foot view of the ability to go ahead and see what's transpired in the shop during that time frame. So the very first one up at the top of the screen says Summary Report. I'm going to click on Print here at the bottom. The Summary Report, along with just about every report that's in this section here, is going to look at the date range we have defined here. We'll talk more about our conditions functionality as we go through, and print the report for that day's for the selected time frame. If I click on Print, we're going to go ahead and we're going to print that to the screen. As I print it to the screen and click on OK, what you'll notice is we open a separate window. One of the nice things about the change that we made to the print functionality beginning with version 1.27 was that it no longer takes focus away from the reporting menu. We can have the reports brought up on the screen, and if I'd like, print multiple different reports, and I can jump back and forth one to the other. In versions prior to 1.27, the print engine would either print it to the screen, take focus, wouldn't let you go back and reprint another report until you actually closed the existing report, and or we could spool it off to the printer at any point in time. In this case, I've got my Summary Report, which I printed up to the screen, and again, this is kind of that 50,000-foot view of the activity that took place in the shop in that day. Starting with at the top, here's a sales breakdown in terms of parts, labor, and or sublet. What you'll notice on my screen, it said sales, and in parentheses it says the word tires with an asterisk in front of it. This is part of the sales breakout piece, and what this means is the items that are listed here with the asterisk in front of them, they're in red, are actually segregated out so I can pick and choose which sales end up in this separate line item. The intention or the concept of how this was built was we had a number of requests to break out tires on this report, specifically tires, and what we looked at was we said, well, not every shop is going to want to do that. Let's make it somewhat open architecture. Let's give the end user the ability to define not only what that says. So where this says tires, in just a moment, we'll take a look at how we would change that to something else. And if you notice parts, labor, and subtotal, in my case, for the day, we did today's sales transactions, I had $152 in parts, sales, and tires, $20 in labor. That represented just under 10% of my total sales, just over 1% of my total sales. So 11% was in my breakout, or in my case, my tires, versus about 89% of my sales were in general repair. So as you look at these three items here, these are following this breakout here, and there's configurable settings that tell the system what belongs there. We'll go take a look at those here in just a moment. We've got our sales, and we also have our gross profit. If you'll notice, same three, same parentheses up here at the top, so we can, again, break out those sales in that different piece. In this case, I want to see what my profit was for my non-tire repairs versus my profit on my tire repairs. Specifically, typically driven by the fact that tire sales themselves tend to be at a lower margin. So I'd like to be able to segregate those out into their own area. Before we get too much further, the answer is we can have one section broken out, meaning I can't have it add 3 more lines or 3 more lines or 3 more lines and have this continue to break out. On the summary report, the intention, again, because it's that 15,000 foot view, was to keep it on a single page, to keep it just to a single item that we can break out. And again, we'll look at how we configure that here in just a moment. So as we look at the sales part, we've got parts, labor, sublet, broken down either by taxable and or non-taxable. We've got gross profit, again, parts, labor, sublet, broken down. Here's our sales and our cost, and then our margin, both parts and labor, as we go through. And one of the things that it's important to pay attention to, or at least I like to point out with this here, is you'll notice that on the gross profit report, we've got our parts cost and our parts sales. Fairly straightforward. I bought a part for this, I sold it for that. Those are where those numbers come from. On the labor side, I sold the labor for this. This was my cost of labor. We went back and looked over on the RO Writer side. I'm just going to pull up a transaction that I've got in my work in progress. In this case, Ron Stevens is a fuel pump that we were going to replace on his vehicle. I pulled up that window there. What you'll notice is I don't yet have a technician assigned to this job. When the technician gets assigned to the job, in the lower right-hand corner, what it does is it will take and it will multiply the average hourly cost for that technician times the build time. So if I was to select, on my case, I don't have any technicians punched in. Let's go ahead and let's get somebody on the clock for the day. But if we go down to my time clock, and I'll punch Bart Smith in, get him on the clock, let him get started on working for the day. Because if I go ahead and I go and assign Bart Smith to that job, what we'll notice is once I assign Bart Smith, my cost of labor gets populated. And again, what the system is doing is associated with Bart Smith's technician record is an average hourly cost. It's taking that average hourly cost, multiplying it times my build time to determine what that cost would be. So as we look at any of the reports in the sales report window where we see a labor cost, and we'll assign Bart to all parts and labor on this technician. But any report where I see a labor cost, it's driven by when we assign the technician, if there is a cost associated with that technician, and again, it multiplies that cost times the build time in order to come up with that cost for that technician. So here we've got our cost of labor and our margin on labor, and if we came down tires, the same numbers. You see my margin on labor a little bit more significant because I only give him 1/100th of an hour in order to put that tire on there. Not exactly fair, but that's the way that the numbers fell out in my report or my example. As you look down here at the bottom, you'll notice my blended margin 61.94% versus my gross profit is 70.15%. The difference between these two numbers here is this number here is calculated including the cost of labor, both here in my breakout and here in my primary. This number down here is not calculated using the cost of labor. It is strictly the total sales against the parts margin. So if you did the math, what we'd be looking at would be the cost of the parts versus the total sales to determine where that margin came in. So that's the difference between this number here and this number here. And then this just takes into account any shop supplies, whether they were taxable or non-taxable, that were collected during that time frame. $113.94 in sales tax. Other taxes and fees would be any non-taxable fees that were collected. In AutoWriter, as you're accumulating and or you're putting fees onto a transaction, what you can do is you can define whether or not those fees are taxable or non-taxable. Meaning, you know, in most states, let's say for example, a number of states, you may have to collect a state tire fee that you would remit directly to the state. In most cases, that is not a taxable fee. Meaning, in Illinois, for the privilege of selling a tire, we have to remit $2.50 to the state. So I collect that from the consumer. However, I do not charge the consumer tax. So those fees that are not charged sales tax get broken out here. So that way, as we look over here, non-taxable fees is broken out in its own separate entity as well, so that when we're calculating sales tax, we're not including those non-taxable fees. If I was upcharging for credit cards, meaning I said if you use American Express or when you use a Discover or a MasterCard, it's going to be an extra 2%, that's where those credit charges would appear. So our total other sales, $223.58. We didn't take any advance payments or any AR payments in the time frame designated, so my total sales and other comes down to just the total number of sales along with my other. Down here at the bottom, we get a breakdown of the different tender types that were collected as part of today's business. And then down in the lower right-hand corner, this was the total amount transacted, whether it was, again, sales, sales tax, other taxes and fees, AR payments, advance payments. There was my total amount transacted for the day we selected. 18 total invoices with an average per of $92, and then here's my sales total. So again, summary report a fairly high-level view in terms of looking at what transpired at the shop during the day. So as we finish up our conversation about the sales report, I did make mention that we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at where these come from, meaning these breakouts and how these get defined. So I'm going to close my sales report here for just a moment. Back into the reporting module, starting with in the lower left-hand corner of sales reports, there's a button there that says Sales Report Options. If I clicked on Sales Report Options, what that does is it brings up a small window. My options are Summary Report Breakout Label. Let's say we're going to just change that to MISC, just so that we can see a difference in the behavior. So this is what drives what shows up in parentheses as the label for what's been broken out. Three other options I've got here: package savings coupons and fleet discounts. And it asks on these particular reports, the sales by technician and the technician sales summary, whether they should include package savings, coupons, or fleet discounts. Now, package savings and coupons are typically driven by the module called AutoWriter Express. If anybody's been out there and seen the AutoWriter Express module, it was a module that was originally designed for use primarily in the quick lube industry. It's not a module that we're actively continuing to distribute and or use, but it was still adopted by some shops back in the day. So if they were using the package savings functionality and or the coupon functionality, this would help to determine whether or not the dollar amounts that showed on these reports were the full total dollar amounts or whether they were the adjusted dollar amounts based upon any savings or package savings and or coupons that were applied. If you're using the Fleet Wizard, you have the option to potentially assign what's called an off-invoice discount. So for a national fleet transaction, if I did $100 worth of work for ARI, there may be a 10% revenue scrape or discount that's been negotiated with ARI. And so as I do $100 worth of work for ARI, I actually only get remitted $90 back for that work that was performed. Question is, should my technician be given credit for $100 or $90, depending on if it's been done through the Fleet Wizard as part of an off-invoice fleet discount? So my options here really driving these two reports to determine whether these would get subtracted from my technician sales or whether they'd be included in that value. Summary report breakout label where it says MISC, I'm going to click on OK, and if I was to go back and run my summary report again, what we will see is that what's in parentheses there, top of my summary report, no longer says tires, it now says MISC. So that value we just changed, all it does is it changes what it says in these parentheses here. How you change what shows up in those parentheses is actually done in the configuration module. If I jump back over into AutoWriter to configuration, and in here, underneath configuration, I'm going to start first with parts because it's actually done separately, parts and labor. We start underneath the parts menu, over into parts department groups. I'll bring up my parts department groups window. And when I do, In my case, I'm going to go all the way down to the very bottom where the very last group in my list says tires. Notice on the left-hand side, breakout parts on sales summary report. And in this case, MISC is the tag, and I can put a check mark in the box. So that tells the system that on the summary report, don't put it in the black lines, put it in the red lines down here at the bottom. And if I'd like to add more than one department group in there, if I said, well, you know what, I'd like tires, I'd also like to put batteries in there as well. I could just select that department group, check the box. There is no limit to the number of groups that you can put in there. We just have to tell it that in this case now tires and batteries are both going to be in that list once I click on Save. Now that handles the parts. So as you're assigning a part to a transaction, you assign a department to the part. If that department is in the department group and it's flagged to breakout, and that'll be on that summary report in that breakout section. Closing out of there under configuration down to labor, and in this case we're going down to labor operations. Again, if I went down to my category for tires, and when I get down towards the bottom, there's my tire service category, and in my case, jobs number 305 to 320 are the jobs that I use whenever I sell a customer a new tire. So in this case, my one tire amount and balance, notice in the lower left-hand corner, there's that same checkbox. Break out the labor on the sales summary report. In this case, again, MISC, still my delineation, that'll show up on that side. So again, it's the one tire amount and balance functionality that in this case, we've added on. We're going to break that out. Back to my example of if I said, well, I'd like to go ahead and I'd like to change my batteries to have them show up in there as well, I'd simply come down here to my battery category, where in this case, we're going to put it underneath starting and charging. And under starting and charging, in there I've got install battery. I'd like to break that out as well. And maybe I've got more than one labor operation, in this case 65, 75, and 85-month batteries. I'll go through each one individually and tell them all that we'd like to break them out on that sales summary report. So all I do is I simply put check marks in those boxes, any labor dollars that are associated with that labor operation. It doesn't matter how it gets added onto the transaction, whether it's tied to a smart job or through the NextPart integration or the NAPA ProLink integration or just the labor icon. However it gets added onto the ticket, it's going to report into that broken out section on the summary report. I don't know that I had any battery sales in the day that we've selected here to look at, but if I simply closed out of my summary report window, and it'll immediately reflect the changes. If I clicked on print, allow that to compile again, and now again we've got our summary report compiled. In my case, I didn't have any extra dollars that dumped in, but if I had any battery sales, and or as soon as I did, they'd show up in that broken out section. So again, with the summary report, you have a little bit of an option in order to configure what comes up, and it's specifically relative to these breakouts, these red lines that show up here, not only what they say, but what dollars will report into those particular sections. To close back out of here to get back to my sales reports window. As we go through the sales reports window, the second report down is called the shop performance report. It's a little bit unique in that, as you'll notice, when I select the shop performance report, it's going to gray out my end date. Grays out the end date because there are certain values on the shop performance report that are assessed and or recorded for each day. I'm going to click on print down here at the bottom. And so this report will only generate itself for a single day's time frame. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull this report up. And the shop performance report was actually put together with version 1.28. So it was new just a couple of versions ago as a way to take some key numbers from different reports inside of the program and bring them together into a single report. So it goes through and it's going to compile this information. It's going to bring it forward. One of the reasons this takes a little bit longer in order to compile itself is it's doing things like totaling up what my total inventory was on this day. It's also totaling up what my outstanding AR would be or my fleet transactions. So as we go through, click on OK. It's going to bring up that shop performance report. And again, no pretty graphs, just a couple of colors as we go through, but most of the same numbers we saw in the summary report, plus a handful of others. For example, here's my quick view, parts, labor sales, and shop supplies, my total repair order count, as well as average per, and then my gross profit number. Over here to the right, my sales versus my gross profit. So again, similar numbers to what we saw over on the summary report, just again, not quite as extensive. We don't have the breakout on the shop performance report. As we get into the center, it does month to date. I'm sorry, it goes the current date, week-to-date, month-to-date, and year-to-date sales as we go through. So it gives us all the numbers in terms of what our total sales were for each of those individual time frames. And then on the right-hand side, our average ticket time, dollar per parts, and labor per RO. So some other metrics that people will look at on a fairly frequent basis over there on the right-hand side. If you use the RO-Writer accounting interface to do your as part of your end of day, it will capture the cash drawer reconciliation that was entered as you went through. Tell us what were our total sales for the individual tender types, as well as the drawer countdown, whether it was even and or balance. On the right-hand side, we had other charges, for example, supply charges, other taxes and fees, advance and AR pay. In the little right-hand corner, it tells me that right now my beginning AR balance was just over $2,300. I did have one AR sale, so my ending AR balance went up by just a small amount, about $25. So my outstanding AR as of close of business was $23.87.82. This is a two-page report, meaning towards the top of this window, you can see I've got page 1 of 2. Using the arrows up there, I can either go to the next page or go to the last page. In this case, it doesn't matter which one. It's only a two-page report, but additional information listed on that second page. For example, here was my beginning inventory balance. I should probably talk to my inventory guy about $116,000 worth of inventory, but I sold $30 out of stock. $30 total was what was sold off of my shelf, versus I had $605 in parts that we bought on the outside that were purchased. So my ending inventory balance ended up being $116.22 on this particular day. A breakdown by individual category of the jobs and or the types of service that was performed that day. I had 13 other, 4 brake, 5 exhaust jobs on that day. None of them ended up being fleet transactions. I did have 34 hours worth of payroll for the day, so here were my technicians and whether they are currently clocked in or clocked out. And down at the bottom, a little bit of the breakdown of the technician performance. For example, we got Bart Smith. He performed 23 jobs for a total sale of $728.27, only $30.34 per job as an average. But he did, on average, 3.36 jobs per clock hour. He's been here for 7 hours. 23.5 jobs, so 3.36 jobs per clocked hour, producing $104.04 per hour. So he is far and away my highest producer in terms of dollars per hour. He had 4.84 hours of build time. What that means is if I look back at RO-Writer, and inside of this window here, there was 1.1 hours of build time on this transaction. So as I finalize this transaction, Bart then gets credit for 1.1 hours. So the right actual time and clock time. Well, clock time is just how many hours was he on the time clock. 7 hours is his total as of current. And so if we've got our clock time and our build time, the other value that we can track is the actual time. If I go back down into RO-Writer, and this is the way it's been done traditionally, if I just click on the labor operation to highlight it, and I'm going to hit the T as in Tom, key on the keyboard. What you'll notice is this little icon out here on the left-hand side turns to a clock. What that essentially does is that started keeping track of exactly what would the elapsed time be for having to perform that service, meaning 1.1 is the book time. In theory, we should be able to get that done in maybe, 3/4 to 8/10 of an hour, as opposed to being the full 1.1. So let's use that time to determine exactly how long it took Bart to remove and replace that fuel pump. If we're utilizing that time clock, then the actual time will get populated as well. So in this case, build time, actual time, clock time. Productivity compares the amount of build time versus the total number of hours he was there. He was at a 69.14% productivity. In theory, we could have billed more hours than because he was actually there. His efficiency was 78%, meaning 4.84 hours were billed. It took him 6.14 hours to do that work. So we either maybe not did build correctly, or he's not at his peak efficiency because he's taking a little bit longer than what the book says he should in order to perform that service. So again, the shop performance report brings a bunch of information together from various assorted reports, brings them all into one place. It does run just for the single day only because, again, things like our inventory information, employee hours, the fleet sales starting and ending, as well as the AR balance and our accounting interface reconcile are all for that specific day that was selected as we go through. I'm going to close back out of here to get back to my RO Writer window and then bring us back over to our sales reports. As we go through and continuing on through our list, we'll notice down at the bottom there's a button here that says Batch. I'm going to click on Batch. The concept of batch is just every night when our service writer or manager, whoever's closing up the shop for that day, needs to print out however many pieces of paper I'd like, whichever reports I want, all he has to do is click on Batch and then hit Print. The system will go ahead and it will generate those reports for the day that's been selected. In my case, I have them print the summary report, the shop performance report, and the RO profit report. So all my service advisor or whoever's closing the day for me does, they just hit Batch, they hit Print, and they go on to whatever their next task would be. All these reports spool themselves off to the printer. I'd like to have them print another report. Let's say we're going to print the parts detail report, just so I know exactly which reports or which parts were on in transactions that day. All I'll do is I'll change that X to a check mark, click on Save, and then now when he comes back in to hit Batch, now that's included as part of the batch. Click on Save because I don't want to actually go through and print the batch at this particular moment in time, but I do want to talk about some of the other reports that we're looking at in this window here. So the summary report, the shop performance report, the third one that I had checked as I went through and did my batch was the RO profit report. One of the things that I've wanted to do or that we've talked with customers about as well, to pay attention very closely to the margin on an individual transaction or individual day. So we print the summary report, and the summary report tells us that here was our performance for the day, and our margin was X. So in our case, I think it was about 65%. So I'd like to have a particular goal in mind, and if I don't meet that goal, I'd like a quick way to go back and see what may have either taken the number higher or taken the number lower. In this case, I look to the right-hand side. I can see that I had a handful of transactions in here where I had a very low margin. In fact, quite a few of them where the margin was actually negative. Now, they were fairly low dollar amounts, so in this case, they were all my oil change specials at $19.99, but certainly that's going to drag my overall margin down. This one here at 54% or this one here at 91%, again, either fell above and or below my margin expectation. Either one might merit consideration in terms of trying to assess why it ended up where it did. So the repair order profit report just gives us by parts and labor by individual transaction what the profitability was. So if that's some metrics that I'm paying attention to on a daily basis, and maybe a report that I want to at least have at my disposal. Now you can reprint these reports, any one of them, at any point in time. So just because we didn't print it during end of day does not mean that we no longer can view that report. We could go back and reprint any report at any point in time for any time frame. As we go through, I want to just again touch on some of the other reports that are there. I said about a dozen or so. We've gone through just a few, and I'm again close to my half-an-hour delta, but bear with me for just another moment as we go through. As we go through our listing here, there's one that's called the RO Sales Ledger Report. I want you to pay particular attention to this box here that says Group by Tax ID. When I click on that report, you'll notice that that thing lights up. This is the only report in the system that pays attention to that flag. And what that flag does is it will group the sales by what's called the tax ID. In RO Writer, by default, you'll have tax exempt and you'll have taxable sales. So whether I configure any additional sales tax rates at all, I will have those two options available to me. In this case, I've got just my default tax type, and all of the sales that transpired that day were in that default tax type. But if I was to run this for, let's say, a quarter, it would break down or it would group the sales based on, well, what was tax exempt versus what was subjected to sales tax. If I was in an area where I had variable taxation, for example, there are states that have a separate tax rate for agricultural vehicles. So if I was servicing those vehicles, I'm charging a different tax rate potentially than I am for just passenger or over-the-road vehicles. So I would want to be able to report, well, what were my agricultural sales versus my standard tax rate versus my tax exempt, and this report would do that for you. Again, with that group by tax ID check, it will give you a subtotal by the individual tax type. As we go through our payments ledgers, both the summary and the detail are just there to give us the detail of how each transaction was paid. Meaning a summary report will tell us we collected $2,000 in Visa MasterCard on a given day. The sales of the payments ledger will give us the breakdown of, and oh, by the way, this much was on this transaction for this customer, so I can see the difference. Or if I'm trying to true up each individual transaction, I can see that on the payments ledger, either the summary and or the detail. The only difference between the summary and the detail is if you take multiple tender types. So for example, I got 6 different Visa gift cards to pay for this transaction, and I recorded them as $50, $50, $50, and so on. The detail would list those out all individually. The summary would just say we had $300 in Visa gifts or in Visa MasterCard sales. It wouldn't tell you by individual tender type. So if you're in the practice of taking multiple payments of the same tender type, you want to be able to see exactly what amount was on each individual transaction, then the detail would give you that breakdown. As we continue down, a handful of other reports that are in the itemized sales report, and I bring up this report specifically because this is an excellent report if you're looking to actually find units of sale. What I mean by that is I'd like to know exactly how many tires did I sell for this time frame. In this case, I only had 2 units that day. I had 6 units in my brake department, 2 in brake pads, 40 units of motor oil that were sold in that day. So if you're looking to find units of sale, the itemized sales report is an excellent option, or it's the report I would point you towards to find that information. As we continue on down a little bit, we have the labor summary and or the labor detail report. Sorry, this one here or this one here. As we looked at the shop performance report, the second page at the bottom had information about my technicians, not only their proficiency, their efficiency, their book time, their actual time, their clock time. I wanted to do that same report for an extended date range. So let's look and see exactly how that transpired for the month of July, either the labor summary or the labor detail report. And again, as it would imply, the summary report is going to give us those sum totals, meaning if I was to look at page 2 of that report, there's the sum total for all of the work that was performed for that month's time frame. If I wanted to see the detail of, well, we had $4,000 in total for Bart Smith for that time frame, what actually makes up that, then the detail would give us by individual job the information about each technician. By pay date, labor summary, and labor detail, the difference of the pay date reports is inside of that job back on the hour writer side. When the job is finished, so if I clicked on finished, it will record the pay date. So the pay date, if I don't ever flag it as finished, will get recorded as the same day that the invoice is finalized. If I check the box as finished, the pay date will maintain the current date, meaning if I waited 2 more days to finalize this, my pay date would still be 8/11/2015. If you hold jobs over from one week to another or one pay period to another, any degree of frequency, you want to make sure your technicians are getting paid for it during the time frame in which the job was actually performed. Then again, you could flag a job as finished, and then based upon that pay date, it would show back up on that labor summary or detail by the pay date report as we go through. If we keep scrolling on down through my sales reports list, there's one down here as we get about halfway through called the sales by category report. There's about a half a dozen reports that are very similar in terms of their layout to the sales by category report. One thing that I'll point out when I select this report is on the right-hand side. If you'll notice, there's now a button that says Select All that appears. If I was to click off that sales by category report, again, that sales summary comparison doesn't use this piece, but the sales by category report does. And the concept of this was, again, as we talked about the summary report, we had requests to say, I'd like to break out, the original request was break out tires. We said, well, let's let the end user decide whether it's tires or something else. The concept here was, well, I'd like to print a report, and I'd like to define which categories it does or does not include. So in this case, I could go through and I could say, well, you know what, I don't want to have my batteries or my tires included in this particular report. So let me uncheck my starting and charging, uncheck my tire service, and then now if I ran this report, it would generate for only the categories that were selected. I came back in here, back up to the top and clicked on Show All. When I do, it says that we're going to include every category in that list. Again, there's about a half a dozen reports that will pay attention to that functionality. When I print this report, I'm going to print this to the screen. As we looked at the shop performance report, it gave us the category breakdown for a single day. The sales by category report, in my case, we've now printed that for a month's time frame. It tells me that we had 254 jobs in my break category, and this was the revenue it generated, the costs associated, and the average job, as well as the profitability. If I wanted to see the detail of exactly what made up that breaks, if you notice when I hover over the category listing breaks and double click on it, it takes me and it shows me the breakdown by technician. I can even go one step further and I could double click on my technician to see exactly what makes up that number. What you'll notice across the top here is each of these is opening up a new tab as we go through. So if I just clicked on that tab and said, let me see what that other would be for Bill Fosterman, it looks like he's done a lot of courtesy checks along with some free oil changes that we had out there on a coupon. So again, in this case, as you get back to the main report, each of these is just opening up another tab as we go along. So this is what we call a drill down report. There is information behind this report that you can get to by simply double clicking on the category and get to the detail of what makes up that number. Again, about a half a dozen reports that are all kind of similar in terms of the performance. Any of the ones that would allow us to change and or modify the category listing would also allow us to go through and drill into some of the detail. Above that, I did skip over the conditions for Profit Center and Service Writer. If I'm using Profit Center, the concept of the Profit Center being I've got more than one revenue generating stream in my business, I'd like to keep track of them individually. So if I say, well, I've got general repair, I also have a quick lube bay. Or maybe I've got a fleet repair business along with just my over-the-counter consumer, and I'd like to be able to keep track of those elements differently. Each job gets assigned a Profit Center, and I could then run reports that would segregate it down by just that Profit Center to figure out, well, what is my average margin for my quick lube bay versus my general repair. The Service Writer, if I had two guys at the front counter, in my case I've got Andy and I've got Earl both working at the front counter, I'd like to compare average dollar per ticket, margin. I'd like to compare the profitability of the parts that are on each transaction. I could run reports individually by Service Writer as well. So again, some other filter conditions that we have available to us. And we finish up our sales reports conversation. Just a couple of last reports that I'd like to point out. As we continue down towards the bottom, a lot of folks will print the outside purchases report. This will tell me any parts that were sold during the time frame designated as non-stock items. So in theory, that's going to give me the detail of all the parts that were bought on the outside that day. If I'm using accounts payable, I might want to print the detail of expenses by supplier report for that day as opposed to the outside purchases report. But this will tell you any part that was sold that was flagged as a non-stock item. Got a couple reports for lost sales by category and lost sales by technician. If I'm wanting to look at spillage, meaning I've got estimates that I created, I've got declined work that was in there, I've got estimates that are open that haven't yet been sold. If I wanted to see where those numbers are, the lost sales report, breaking down either by category and or technician, will help us to see, well, in this case, as we bring this report up on the screen, here was my totals in air conditioning. 56 jobs that were sold, 4 that were declined, none on open estimates, but 4 that were saved to history. So just over 10% of the jobs that I estimated versus just over 10% of the dollars that I had estimated were not in there. So if you looked at this number here, 4 plus 4 versus 64, and or 185 plus 546 versus $5,500 in sold sales are where these numbers come into play. So again, we've got our lost sales report by either category and or technician down there towards the bottom. Sales by labor operation, I'll at least point that one out only because if you're going to spiff guys based upon the labor jobs that have been performed, meaning talked about how to get units of sale for parts. The itemized sales report is the best example of where I can see those numbers. If I wanted to get units of sale for a particular labor job, so for example, if I said, well, we're going to spiff our guys based upon the number of alignments they performed, I came into wheel alignment, and I said, well, we had 7 computerized wheel alignments, and here were those alignments that were performed in that time frame. So again, I can see by labor operation the total number that was performed, again, based upon that sales by labor operation report. Last report before we get out of our sales report window, down there we've got our sales by category comparison. So it behaves slightly differently in that it'll allow us to compare behavior over two disparate time frames. So as opposed to saying, I just want to look at my sales by category for the current month or a more recent time frame, let's see last year to date versus this year to date. Let's see where we are year over year in terms of where our sales, brakes, exhaust, oil change, whatever other category it might be. So the only difference with this here is it asks us to define a date range. It takes just a moment to compile. So we'll click on cancel and not necessarily bring that one up. So again, as we go through sales reports, there's a dozen different reports or so that, again, we find used fairly frequently. There's a purpose to every one of them. So if I didn't touch on a report itself, you're more than welcome to either ask a question in regards and or go up to the help menu and, again, use that as your resource to help to determine what reports may be available or what reports might be applicable. The two icons we wanted to focus in today's conversation were sales reports and other reports. And in this other reports piece, the top section talks about some of the ways that we can see what ROs are in progress or if any have been reopened. The labor on outstanding transactions. We've got call history and call statistics. If you use ROwriter's caller ID functionality, then we'll keep track of what phone calls came in and or out, and do some metrics about call statistics as well, about when are my peak call times, my peak call days, and so on and so forth. We're going to get into the appointment scheduler a bit this afternoon's webinar. If you haven't signed up, we've moved the webinars from last week to this week. So at both 2 p.m. this afternoon and 10 a.m. on Thursday, we're going to talk about the scheduler. So we'll talk about these a bit then. But these would be reports that are all driven by the scheduler, about what appointments are out there and or by technician resource status. And then what reminders have been sent out. And the very last one, hidden relatively well in here, is my employee timesheet, where if I was going to print up a paper report of all those punches, both in and out, I could print my employee timesheet, and the only option that pops up or that I have additional here would be to print one employee per page. So if I had to present my employee with his hours for the week, have him sign off on the sheet, and I wanted to have an individual sheet for each employee, then one employee per page would be my option or my selection.